Chair, and there is nothing in the estimates that shows how much this government has no plan for the future than the savage cuts to early childhood education. Because if anything would show that a government understood what a bright future might look like, it would be to invest in our children. It would be to invest in making sure that our children had the very best and the highest quality early childhood education. And so what has this government done? It has cut the funding for quality early childhood education. 2,000 services. I did listen, Mr Peachy, very carefully, and I'd invite you to go and meet with the 2,000 early childhood education services where funding is being cut. And it's being cut to the tune of up to $320,000. One service that I have spoken to now has a funding shortfall of $320,000 per year because of what that minister allowed to happen to her portfolio. And that's the damage that's been meted out to our children and the future. And this government promised this country a brighter future. That's what they promised, and now we find out exactly what that brighter future looks like. Well, in fact, it looks like a dimmer future. It's a dimmer future for the children because they are going to be having their education dumbed down by having fewer qualified teaching staff actually in early childhood education. And a lot of the sector have said to me, this makes absolutely no sense. From a government that pretends that it wants to lift educational achievement, that's what it pretends it wants to do. You know, the national standards are definitely not the way to do it because all that's doing is measuring what we already know is out there. But that's what they say they want to do, and yet they're cutting the funding for qualified staff in early childhood education. And so they do not understand the investment that is necessary for early childhood education, and they clearly have no plan for the future because it is those children who are our future, and it's definitely not the brighter future that they promised. So 2,000 services are affected, but that's just the tip of the iceberg, Mr Chair, because there are at least 93,000 children and their families affected by this cut. And what's that going to look like? Because the Prime Minister, John Key, is quite fond of saying that he doesn't believe that those huge funding cuts of $295 million is going to be passed on to families. He says that he thinks that somehow the sector's going to absorb that. They're going to kind of, just suck it in. They're going to suck in this $295 million, and that's not going to be passed on to families. But that's not what the officials told that minister. Because the budget papers reveal that the officials warned the government that the cost would be passed on to families and that they estimated that it would be to the effect of between $20 and $45 per child per week, passed on to families. And that's exactly the effect of what this means, because it means that the tax cuts for low and middle income families will be completely taken away by this cut alone, by this funding cut alone. If they want to have their children having access to quality early childhood education, then they are going to end up being out of pocket. But my real concern, Mr Chair, is that this will lead to a three-tier early childhood education system in this country. What you'll get is that if you live in a very wealthy neighbourhood where the parents can afford to pay that extra $20 to $45 per week per child, then that neighbourhood will get 100% qualified staff for their children. That's great. But then if you're in a middle-income neighbourhood, then you're probably going to have to do with Plan B, a second-rate service, which is, maybe up to 80% qualified teachers for your young children. And if you live in a poor neighbourhood, well, the minister's plan for you is a playgroup. And that's completely upside down, because what all the research and evidence tells us is that, in fact, it's the children from the low-income neighbourhoods that should have and absolutely need the highest quality teaching for their early childhood education years, because that can make a real difference to them. They need the people who have qualified, who understand how to make the best of those children, how to get them off to the best start, but not under this government.